Welcome, everyone. This is Sarah from Sma's Family Support Department. Thank you to everyone for joining us for today's clinical trials and research update presentation. We would also like to thank our national presenting sponsors, Biogen and Genentech, as well as platinum sponsor Accredo and supporting sponsor Scholar Rock for their generous support of the 2021 Summit of Strength webinar series. We do appreciate all of the questions that we received in advance of this webinar, and we'll try to answer many of these during the presentation. You're also able to submit questions throughout the webinar using the questions box, which you will find located in your GoToWebinar toolbar. Be sure to also stay on till the end to participate in the Q&A session as well. Please note that the lines will remain muted during the webinar, other than for the speakers. If you have any additional questions after the presentation and the Q&A, please contact the SMA Family Support Team at familysupport@sma.org. We'll be starting today's summit off with an opening presentation from Shannon Flowers, representing Genentech, and she will be sharing their presentation, A Brief Introduction to Evrysdi. Shannon?
Thank you, Sarah, and happy Wednesday to everybody. We're halfway there, aren't we? I'm really excited to be here today, and as she said, my name is Shannon Flowers, and I'm going to be going over a brief introduction to Evrysdi. So our time is limited, so let's get started. Evrysdi is a treatment for SMA proven to make a difference in infants, children, and adults, and people 2 months and older who have a really broad range of symptoms and motor function. Next slide, please. My role with Evrysdi and Genentech is called a Partnership and Access Liaison, also known as a PAL, and this is a picture of our entire team. Each one in this picture is a local main point of contact from Genentech, and we're here to support people living with SMA. Our focus is education for Evrysdi, and we also work with my SMA support team to help you throughout your treatment journey. It is important, although, to let you know that many of us have a medical background, but we do not provide medical advice. Your healthcare provider should always be your main resource for any questions about your health and your medical care. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to discuss 4 main topics. What is Evrysdi and how does it work? How is it being studied and what are those results? How do you take Evrysdi, as well as what are some of the support services that Genentech offers? If you have any additional questions or would like to learn more about Evrysdi after this presentation, feel free to reach out to a local PAL in your area, and I'll go over how to do this at the end of the presentation. With any medication, safety is always an important topic, so let's go over that first. Next slide, please. Evrysdi is a prescription medication used to treat spinal muscular atrophy in adults and children 2 months of age and older. It is not known if Evrysdi is safe and effective in children under 2 months of age. Before taking Evrysdi, tell your doctor if you have any liver problems, if you're pregnant or planning to become pregnant, if you're breastfeeding or plan to breastfeed. Evrysdi may harm an unborn or breastfed baby. Evrysdi may affect a man's ability to have children. Tell your doctor about all the medications that you take, both prescription and over-the-counter. These are not all the possible side effects of Evrysdi, so please refer to additional important safety information throughout the presentation. You can also find the full prescribing information at evrysdi.com. Now let's go over how Evrysdi works. Next slide, please. As many of you know, SMA causes progressive muscle weakness and decreased motor function because of a shortage of an important protein called survival motor neuron, otherwise known as Smn protein. Evrysdi is designed to work by helping make and maintain more Smn protein. Next slide, please. In clinical trials, Evrysdi increased and maintained those levels of Smn protein. We saw within 4 weeks of starting Evrysdi, SMN protein levels more than doubled and were maintained throughout the 12 months of the studies across all of the SMA types. You may be wondering what type of people living with SMA did we include in our trials. Next slide, please. Everest studied a broad range of infants, children, and adults. The Everest clinical trial program includes over 450 people, including infants, children, and adults from ages 2 months to 60 years with types 1, 2, and 3 SMA. We've studied effectiveness in people from 2 months of age to 25 years old. Now let's go into a little bit more detail on what trials were conducted and how they were set up. Next slide. So this is a very kind of a busy slide, so I really want to orient you because it contains a lot of information. In the red box on the left, this box contains the information on our Sunfish Trial, which studied infants with type 1 SMA. This was a two-part study. Part 1 explored the recommended dose for this age group, and the second part looked at the safety and effectiveness in these infants. In the yellow box on the right, that's our Sunfish Trial. This was a study with children and adults from ages 2 to 25 with types 2 and 3 SMA. Now, this study differed in that it was a randomized placebo-controlled trial, which means that participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups. One group was actually getting active medication, and the other group was getting a placebo, which means they are not receiving active medication. This was also a two-part study. Part 1 was a dose-finding study, and Part 2 measured the safety and effectiveness. There is a third and supportive study called Jewelfish that is currently looking at the safety of Everest for people with types 1, 2, and 3 SMA who were previously treated with another SMA medication. A third and supportive, and so next we're going to look at the results of the Firefish and the Sunfish trial. Next slide. Everest helped infants with type 1 SMA achieve a key motor milestone. Many of you may know untreated infants with type 1 SMA are not expected to sit without support. But in Firefish, Everest helped infants with type 1 SMA achieve that key motor milestone. After 12 months of treatment with Everest, 41% of these infants were able to sit for at least 5 seconds without support. And there were actually additional observations from the Firefish study. Next slide. Everest helped infants survive without permanent breathing support. At 12 months, 90% of the infants in the study were alive and could breathe without permanent support, and at 23 months, 81% were alive and could breathe without permanent support. Next, let's go over the Sunfish trial that I mentioned earlier, which looked at children and adults with types 2 and 3 SMA. Next slide. Children and adults treated with Everest showed improved motor function versus those not taking Everest or in the placebo group. The slide that you're looking at now shows the blue line on the line graph are those participants taking Everest, and the gray bar are those that were on placebo. We measured motor function in these participants using the Motor Function Measure 32 score. And what we found was at the end of 12 months, as you can see, those taking Everest had an increase in their motor function score. They had an increase of 1.36 points. And as you look at the gray line, you can see that those that were not taking any medication at all had a decrease in their motor function score of 0.19 points. And as we mentioned before, safety is always at top of mind, so let's review some additional safety information. Next slide. Evrysdi is being studied in people from 2 months to 60 years of age with type 1, 2, or 3 SMA. The most common side effects we saw in the infant group in our Sunfish trial included fever, diarrhea, rash, lung infection, constipation, vomiting, upper respiratory infections such as runny nose, sneezing, sore throat, and cough. In our Sunfish trial in children and adults with type 2 or 3 SMA, the most common side effects were fever, diarrhea, and rash. These are not all the possible side effects of Evrysdi. So when considering taking this medication, it's important to discuss with your doctor about the balance between risk and benefit. I would also like to highlight that in over 450 people that were participants in the clinical trials, none of those stopped taking the medication due to side effects in the 12 months they were in the clinical trials. Safety in people previously treated with other SMA medications is currently being studied, as I mentioned before, in our Jewelfish trial. So now let's just take a minute to talk about how it's taken. Next slide. Evrysdi is the first and the only medication to treat SMA with at-home dosing. It is a liquid treatment taken every day by mouth or can be given by a feeding tube. It's conveniently delivered directly to your home, stored in your refrigerator, and you measure your dose by using the syringes that are provided each month with your medications. As you know, the treatment for SMA is a journey, and to help along this journey, Genentech offers a number of support services, and one of those is called Sma Support. Next slide. As part of the Sma Support Team, the PALs, which is my role, are here to provide education and information about insurance and financial assistance. We also collaborate with the specialty pharmacy for your at-home delivery. During these times, we're able to meet with you and your family virtually on the platform of your choice. And we also are able to provide you with interpretive services through the Language Line Solutions, which offers translations for over 240 languages and dialects. I know we've covered a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So before we end, let's do a very quick recap. Next slide. Evrysdi is proven to make a difference in infants, children, and adults living with SMA. It improved motor function scores in 2 main studies of infants, children, and adults. And it increased and maintained SMN protein levels in our clinical trials. As we saw that as early as 4 weeks, and they were maintained throughout the 12 months of the clinical trial. The safety of Evrysdi is being studied in a broad patient population from ages 2 months to 60 years of age with all types of SMA, types 1, 2, and 3. It's the first and only oral treatment for SMA that's delivered to your door and taken conveniently at home. If you're considering treatment for SMA, this may be the right time to talk to your doctor or healthcare provider about Evrysdi. You can visit Evrysdi.com to learn more and see the full prescribing information, including special specific patient information. The website is also where you connect with your local PAL that covers your geography. Next slide. Thank you very much for allowing me to be part of your Summit of Strength today. And there is an additional way that you can connect with your local PAL. You can go to smasignup.com, and that will connect you with your local Genentech representative. So again, thank you. It's been my pleasure to participate with Cure SMA today. And I will turn it back over to Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon, for being with us today and sharing your presentation. We really appreciate it. Now, we would like to give a warm welcome to today's presenter, Jackie Glasgot, who is Cure SMA's Director of Research Programs. Jackie will be presenting on clinical trials and research updates. So thank you so much, Jackie.
Thanks, Jess. As Jess said, I'll be giving a brief background on clinical trials and our research objectives at Cure SMA. Next slide, please. I'm sure many of you have seen this drug pipeline before, and as you all know, we currently have 3 approved therapeutics, 5 additional drugs in clinical trials, and several drugs that are in the preclinical or early drug discovery phase. And we'll talk more about those approved therapies and the trials momentarily here. Next slide, please. There is an evolving landscape in the SMA field. The FDA approval of those 3 new therapies has really changed the natural history of SMA profoundly. And we know that early identification and treatment dramatically alters long-term outcomes, especially most robustly when drugs are given pre-symptomatically. But we also know that symptomatic treatment is able to provide improvements through increases in strength, stabilization, and slowing of disease progression. However, about 50% of all SMA patients currently remain untreated. So there's still large unmet need amongst the SMA community. Next slide, please. And before we get into the trials and the drug data, I think it's helpful just to review the SMA gene region here. On this slide, you can see Smn1 and Smn2. Smn1 is the gene that's missing or mutated in SMA, and in SMA, you have to lose both copies of your Smn1 gene. And so when that is the case, you're relying on Smn2, which is an inverted duplicated copy of the Smn1 gene. And you can see here highlighted this C to T transition. And that's a nucleotide change. So if you remember, nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA. And so when you change that single nucleotide, what happens is that one of the exons in the pre-mRNA, so these are the pieces that get put together to make the message that is then made into protein, in this case, SMN protein. What happens with that transition is it causes a piece of this genetic material, particularly exon 7, to be excluded. And so when you exclude exon 7, it's like you're missing an important puzzle piece that makes the protein. And that's represented here by pink. And so this pink protein here represents that protein that is lacking exon 7. And so it's truncated and it's not as functional as full-length SMN protein. And so you, as you may know, the more copies of SMN2 one has, usually the less severe the form of SMA that they have generally presents. And so the more copies of SMN2 you have, the more full-length protein you're getting, because you are getting about 10% full-length protein from the SMN2 gene. And this truncated protein does lend some functionality. So the more copies of SMN2 you have generally, the less severe the disease. Next slide, please. Yes, and so in the case of SMA, Smn1 is the missing gene. And then when we get into therapeutic strategies, I like to think of those kind of in 2 camps. And the first camp is SMN dependent, and the second camp is SMN independent therapies. And so we'll begin by talking about those that are SMN dependent. And those include things like gene therapy or Zolgensma, which replaces the missing SMN1 gene via a viral vector. They include therapies that might increase SMN2 promoter activation. So you can imagine that if you turn this SMN gene on more and crank out more protein, you'll get more of that green full-length protein, and that's advantageous. Or you can think about modulating the splicing, which is just the word for how this piece, how these exons are pieced together in order to promote inclusion of that exon 7 that's usually spliced out in order to generate more full-length protein. And that's what antisense oligonucleotides, ASOs, or the small molecules like Spinraza and Everest seek to do. Next slide, please. And so that other camp of therapies that I mentioned was Smn2-independent therapies. And these are things that offer neuroprotection, so protecting the nerve itself against injury or degradation, or muscle enhancement, so making the muscle stronger or better able to function. And those would include drugs like the Cytokinetics drug in clinical trials, or the Scholar Rock drug, or the Biogen muscle drug, that are all in clinical trials, and we'll touch more on those later. And it's also important to note that you can have some combination of multiple therapies as well as a possibility. So you can think about combining an Smn-dependent therapy with an Smn-independent therapy, or multiple Smn-independent therapies for maximal therapeutic effect. Next slide, please. And we'll begin by talking about some of these Smn-dependent therapies. The first of which we'll talk about today is Smn1 gene replacement, known as Zolgensma. And that was approved in May of 2019 for patients less than 2 years of age. It's a one-time intravenous IV infusion, and it uses an AAV9 viral vector to deliver the Smn1 gene. And you can see here, this is a map of the viral vector, and essentially this blue block here represents the human Smn cDNA that is being delivered by that viral vector, effectively replacing the missing Smn1 gene. Next slide, please. And so one of the trials of Zolgensma that we'll talk about is called SPRINT. And this was done in pre-symptomatic infants, and they were all 6 weeks of age or younger. The first patient in this trial was dosed back in April of 2018, and all of these infants had 2 or 3 copies of Smn2. This is a schematic here that shows kind of the basic overview of the study. Next slide, please. And so if we look at the infants in SPRINT, in the cohort which had 2 copies of Smn2, we can see that 100% of them are alive, and they have no need for ventilatory support. And in this figure, it's a bit busy, but I think you can see that the red circles indicate achieved milestone. The blue indicate that it wasn't achieved at that time point yet, but you can see if you look across the figure that 11 out of 14, or 75 or 79% of the children in this study were able to achieve sitting in this time frame. 36% achieved standing alone, and 29% achieved walking. Next slide, please. And so we saw dramatic improvements in that pre-symptomatic trial, SPRINT. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the long-term follow-up studies that are being done with Zolgensma. And so we can kind of group those into 2 categories: long-term follow-up 1, I like to refer to, which is this top one from START, and then these other studies which all had the option for enrollment in the long-term follow-up 2. Next slide, please. So this is giving overviews for the study design for long-term follow-up 1 as well as 2. These are optional 15-year long-term follow-ups, and they differ a little bit in their study visit or contact throughout those 15 years, but you can see the basic overview of each here. I won't go into it for the sake of time. Next slide, please. And so when we look at long-term follow-up, and this is the long-term follow-up 1, and the data cutoff here was June of 2020. You can see that they're comparing ventilation-free survival here amongst the children and young adults in the therapeutic cohort, which is indicated by this green line across the top with 100% ventilation-free survival, as compared to a PNCR study of the natural history of SMA. So dramatic improvement in ventilation-free survival here. Next slide, please. When we look at again, the START long-term follow-up study, we are now looking at motor function gains. So you can see here the circle, the orange circle is children who got early dosing and had a high baseline motor function. So they're achieving milestones like walking unassisted and sitting unassisted earlier than those who might have had a low baseline, who got early dosing and a low baseline motor function, or who had late dosing. But I think it is important to note that those children are still gaining motor functions a bit later than those dosed earlier or who had a higher baseline motor function, but still gaining motor functions that would be unprecedented in natural history data. Next slide, please. So moving to a different therapeutic strategy now, transitioning away from gene therapy into Smn2 splicing modulation. So if you'll remember, this is an attempt to change this splicing site to include more exon 7. So that missing exon, again, we want to include it in our mRNA transcript, which is then translated into protein so that we get fully functional, full-length SMN protein that's more stable and it's better able to execute its necessary functions. Examples of this would be Spinraza and Everest. Next slide, please. So we'll begin by talking about Spinraza, which was approved just a few days before the end of the year in 2016. It was approved for all types and ages of individuals affected by SMA, and it's an intrathecal administration. Dosing consists of 4 loading doses and then maintenance dosing every 4 months. Next slide, please. The first trial of Spinraza that I want to talk about is Nurture, which was a pre-symptomatic trial. And so this was in infants who were 6 weeks or younger at their first dose of Spinraza. They had 2 or 3 copies of Smn2, and there were 25 babies enrolled in that study, which enrollment was completed in February of 2017. At the time of the data cut, which was February 2020, participants were 2.8 to 4.8 years of age with a median age of 3.8 at their last study visit. At that time, all participants were alive and 84% had never needed ventilation support. Next slide, please. If we look at the motor milestones of these children, they are inconsistent with their SMA type 1 and type 2, and many of them are achieving milestones consistent with normal development. So if you look across the bottom, you're seeing the WHO windows of motor milestone achievement that range from the 1st to 99th percentile for typically developing children. And you can see the sitting without support, most of them are gaining that function within that window, as well as walking with assistance and standing alone, or walking alone, excuse me. Those with 3 copies of Smn2 indicated by the green bars are gaining those motor functions a little bit sooner in general than those with 2 Smn2 copies, but those with 2 Smn2 copies are still gaining those functions, which is remarkable compared to natural history data. Next slide, please. If we transition to the ENDEAR and SHINE trials, ENDEAR was a study for symptomatic children who had symptom onset at 6 months or younger, and they had to get their first dose of Spinraza before or at 7 months of age or younger, and they had 2 copies of Smn2. So you can see here, this is looking at total motor milestone scores. You can see Nurture is in green, and that's for 3-copy infants. Nurture in blue is 2-copy infants, and then down below this navy line is ENDEAR, and then a transition into the SHINE open label extension. The orange line is ENDEAR who were on sham control and then transitioned into SHINE. and so they were not receiving drug, and then when they transitioned into SHINE, they did receive drug. And then the gray line is in deer who were in the sham control cohort of the study. And so you can see the improvements in motor function as children were transitioned into drug from ANDI or sham control to SHINE, and then continued consistent improvements with earlier dosing. Next slide, please. Another trial of Spinraza is called Devote, and this is designed to test the safety, tolerability, and potential for greater efficacy of Spinraza when it's given at a higher dose than is currently approved. And so this is a currently recruiting and ongoing trial. In Part A, that is for people or persons with onset of clinical signs and symptoms consistent with SMA at greater than 6 months of age, and they need to be aged 2 to 15 years. And Part B is for persons with SMA symptom onset at less than 6 months of age. And so that's infantile onset, and they should be greater than a week or and less than 7 months at the time of informed consent. And there's also a cohort within Part B for participants with onset greater than 6 months, and so that's for ages 2 to less than 10 at a time of informed consent, and those individuals need to be able to sit independently but have never had the ability to walk independently, and they have a Hammersmith motor function score range there as well that needs to be between 10 and 54 at screening. And then there's Part C, which is for participants greater than 18 years of age at screening who must be ambulatory. And they need to currently be on nusinersen at the time of screening, as well, with the first dose being at least 1 year prior to screening. Next slide, please. So I won't go through all of this for the sake of time, but you can see there's different groups within the trial to test different dosing regimes, all trying to answer the question if a higher dose than the currently approved 12 milligrams lends better efficacy and if it's still safe and tolerable for patients. Next slide, please. Another study of Spinraza is called RESPOND, and this is a study to evaluate clinical outcomes following treatment with nusinersen or Spinraza in participants who had previously received Zolgensma. So individuals who had gotten Zolgensma and now are seeking further clinical benefit with the addition of Spinraza. The key inclusion criteria for this trial is 3 months to 36 months and 2 copies of Smn2, and of course you must have previously received Zolgensma and have a suboptimal clinical status per your investigator. The first patient in this trial was dosed on January 8th of 2021, so relatively recently, and this is recruiting and ongoing as well. Next slide, please. And so switching gears to another Smn2 splicing modulator, Everest, which we just heard a little bit about. It was FDA approved in August of 2020 for individuals older than 2 months of age. It's a small molecule which alters the splicing of Smn2 to try to produce more fully functional Smn protein, and it's a liquid medication that's given daily either orally or by G-tube. Next slide, please. And so we heard Shannon talk a little bit about Firefish. I'll just recap here briefly. Firefish was for infants 1 to 7 months of age with 2 copies of Smn2, and there were 2 parts, a dose finding part followed by open label extension, and part 2, which was for efficacy and safety at the dose selected in part 1. So if we look at part 1, cohort B, which was the higher dose cohort, at month 24, we saw that 88% of infants were event-free. 59% of them were sitting without support for at least 5 seconds. And the infants continued to achieve motor functions such as sitting and standing. 93% of them were able to feed orally, and 100% of them maintained the ability to swallow. And there were no treatment-related study findings that led to discontinuation of Firefish Part 1. Next slide, please. Sunfish, as you also heard Shannon talk about, was for type 2 or 3 SMA. It was for individuals who are 2 to 25 years old. Patients were treated with Everest. There were 120 of them, or placebo. And Everest patients in the they were either treated with Everest or they were in the placebo arm, and they received the placebo for 12 months followed by Everest treatment for 6 months, or for 12 months, and there were 60 of those patients. At the 24-month endpoint, they were able to maintain motor function improvements as measured by the MFM, which is a motor function measure. They had increased motor function in the RULM and the Hammersmith, both scales of motor function between months 12 and 24. Everest was able to stabilize motor function for patients who began treatment with it after 12 months of placebo, as measured by those various motor function scores. Increased total score from baseline, as measured by the by a caregiver-reported scale, the SMA-IS upper limb module, and the patient-reported SMA-IS score stabilized between months 12 and 24 as well. And we're seeing stabilization in these patients in Sunfish. Next slide, please. Jewelfish is another study of Everest, which was also called risdiplam. And it was for non-naive, so that is individuals who were previously exposed to some SMN upregulating therapeutic. These were patients with SMA type 2 or 3 who were aged 6 months to 60 years. And the data from this jewelfish shows an increase in SMN protein similar to that seen in naive patients, which is about a 2-fold or greater increase in median SMN protein amounts. It has been safe and well tolerated. Next slide, please. And that leads us to Rainbowfish, which is a pre-symptomatic trial of risdiplam or Everest for infants up to 6 weeks of age. Enrollment is ongoing, and it will investigate safety and efficacy in those pre-symptomatic infants. And it's also going to, another goal of the trial is to help determine the dose for infants less than 2 months of age. Next slide, please. And so that concludes our SMN-dependent therapeutic strategies that we'll discuss today. And so now we're transitioning over to those SMN-independent ones. Next slide, please. And so the first one I'll talk about is CK2127107 from Cytokinetics. It was an investigational next-generation fast skeletal muscle troponin activator. And so it aims to act as a muscle activator by slowing calcium signaling in fast skeletal muscle fibers, improving with the goal of improving the force that's able to be generated. And the results did show that it increased force generated versus placebo when responding to nerve stimulation. Single doses were well tolerated in healthy volunteers, and there were no adverse side effects and all adverse effects. There were no serious adverse effects, and all adverse effects were mild or moderate. A phase 2 trial assessing this compound in patients with SMA types 2 through 4 has been completed, and more information can be found on clinicaltrials.gov. Next slide, please. Another drug that is currently in clinical trials for muscle enhancement is abricamab, which is from Scholar Rock. It targets the latent form of myostatin by blocking its activation in muscle. And so there has been a phase 2 trial called Topaz, which is a proof of concept clinical trial to assess the safety and efficacy of SRK-015 or agripamab in patients with type 2 or type 3 SMA. The Topaz trial enrolled 55 patients. They were all between the ages of 2 and 21 across its 3 cohorts. And each cohort represented a distinct subpopulation of patients. All patients received therapy intravenously once every 4 weeks, either alone as a monotherapy or in conjunction with an approved Smn upregulator, which was Spinraza, over a 12-month treatment period. Next slide, please. And so if we look at analysis of that phase 2 Topaz trial, you can see cohort 1 was for individuals 5 to 21 years of age that had ambulatory type 3. They received monotherapy. They were either given monotherapy or in conjunction with nusinersen, and they observed a change from a mean change from baseline in the revised Hammersmith of a 0.3 point decline. Cohort 2 was 5 to 21 years of age. They were type 2 and non-ambulatory type 3s who initiated nusinersen at greater than 5 years old on that same dose of 20 mg/kg, and they observed a functional mean change from baseline in the Hammersmith of a 0.6 point improvement. Next slide, please. If we look at cohort 3 of that Topaz trial, that was greater than or equal to 2 years of age, type 2 patients who initiated nusinersen at less than 5 years of age. So this is this cohort is only individuals who are taking both nusinersen and agripamab. A mean change from baseline in Hammersmith of 7.1 points and 5.3 improvements were seen in the 20 mg/kg and the 2 mg/kg dose arms. So getting an improvement in motor function in that cohort. And next slide, please. I mentioned them and I wanted to summarize the US trials that are currently recruiting. There is Rainbowfish, which is Everest or risdiplam, Devote, and then also Respond, both looking at Spinraza. Next slide, please. So when thinking about joining a trial or starting an approved treatment, it's important to discuss with your healthcare provider safety and efficacy data, the possibility in a trial of receiving placebo, route and timing of administration, understanding inclusion and exclusion criteria of trials, and determining whether previous drug exposure are allowed and when are all important factors to consider when deciding to begin an approved treatment or to join a clinical trial. Next slide, please. Given that there are 3 approved treatments for SMA, it is not recommended that an individual wait for future trials to open if other options are available now. We know that delays in opening trials are common and they can't be predicted. There are also changes in inclusion and exclusion criteria of trials that are common, and they change until the formal announcement is made. And we know that earliest possible administration of SMN enhancing drugs yields the most robust results in terms of motor function gains, and that timing is one of the biggest factors in degree of response to SMN. So we recommend treatment as soon as possible and not to wait for a trial to open if there's not an immediate availability to participate in a trial. Next slide, please. Cure SMA really seeks to fund a comprehensive research program, and we've invested over $80 million in total research funding. We look at this through several arms. Our basic research arm, which seeks to understand disease biology, which informs drug discovery, which has a goal of making practical new therapies. And then we have our clinical and regulatory arm, where we seek to promote the efficient approval of new drugs. And then care research, which seeks to improve patient care and quality of life. We also have an important component of our research program, which is our annual research meeting, what was used to share and promote research and progress amongst the field. Next slide, please. There are several critical gaps that remain after drug approval. We know that we need newborn screening for maximal drug efficacy. So right now, 71% of newborns are currently screened, but we're actively working through our advocacy department and through efforts of the SMA community to reach our goal of 100% of newborns being screened for SMA. We know that approved drugs work most effectively in a smaller subset of patients, those that are dosed pre-symptomatically. And we know that some approved drugs have a non-ideal treatment regime for some patients. We also know that with longer survival, new SMA manifestations may appear that need to be addressed both clinically and therapeutically. And we also want appropriate registries to capture this data of these manifestations that may occur post-drug. This also means that standards of care are changing and becoming more complicated, so we want to continue to promote the best standards of care for all patients and, of course, provide continued support for families. Next slide, please. So our strategic goals in research include building a comprehensive clinical care network and data registry that enables an optimal standard of care for SMA, getting back to ensuring that every patient is getting the best care possible. We also know that the advent of these disease-modifying therapies is redefining our SMA disease classification, and we're looking at that through our clinical data registry, as well as patient-reported data. We also want to enable drug development through our industry collaboration. I'll talk more about that in a second, and continue to fund basic and translational research with the goal of development of combination therapies. Next slide, please. So going back to the industry collaboration, it's 5 companies that are co-funding and shaping projects, and there's several different goals within the group. One of them is regulatory interactions, and here we really seek to inform regulatory agencies of the patient voice, and that includes things like our critical path innovation meeting with the FDA that was held in August 2020, risk-benefit surveys, patient-reported outcome measure development, and the economic burden of disease study that were all recently completed, really trying to help the FDA understand the patient experience and voice. And they also include increasing clinical trial site capacity, as well as education of healthcare providers and patients to reduce diagnostic delay. Next slide, please. And we also have another strategic goal of understanding the new patient experience, and we do this with our Cure SMA database. So this is patient-entered demographics. We have 8,300 affected members within that database, a little over 5,000 newly diagnosed patients since July of 2019. And we use this data to share with industry payers and regulators to help them understand the new patient experience, and it's also used to inform new patients of clinical trials and allow for trial recruitment as well. And to date, 1,100 patients have been placed into 15 clinical trials. Next slide, please. Another strategic goal is combination therapies and multiple drug options, and we do this through investing in our basic research grants and our preclinical drug projects, we're really focused on identifying novel drug targets, so new ways to treat SMA, and then identifying combination therapies, so we can really try to achieve maximally effective treatments for all ages and stages of SMA. And then that includes identifying non-SMN drug targets, testing combinations with approved SMN upregulating drugs, and optimizing SMN enhancing therapies. And so all our requests for proposals for basic and drug discovery research are now geared towards these goals. Next slide, please. And going back to those combinations, we can think about combining SMN independent with some of these approved therapies that are Smn2 splicing modifiers or gene replacement. And the goal here is having a maximally effective treatment strategy as well as care strategy as well to get maximal therapeutic benefit. Next slide, please. Okay, one of our other goals is to identify modifiers of disease as drug targets. So we know when we have SMA manifestations, they can either be more severe or less severe. And so we think of other genes or modifiers that may be involved in causing less severe disease, which would be positive modifiers, or more severe disease, which would be negative modifiers. And by identifying those modifiers, they can be manipulated as potential drug targets, which would allow for the creation of more SMN independent targets for drug development. Next slide, please. So when we think about basic research, we're really thinking about the basic biology of SMA and understanding when, where, and how we need SMN protein. And so this understanding this has led to the current drugs that we have, and we believe it will continue to lead to optimized drugs as well as novel therapeutic targets. It also helps us to know where we need to get SMN delivered with a therapy. So optimizing delivery and targeting of cell types within the body for maximal therapeutic effect. Next slide, please. And so our future goals for the community overall, we want a greater customization of programs. It's a changing disease with changing experiences, and we want to be able to accommodate the needs of those changing parameters. We have a goal of increased local delivery of programs, and we also want to maintain our cohesive community. Ongoing research is looking at different mechanisms and routes of administration, those combinations we've talked about. Increasing clinical trial site capacity, further training of PTs, continuing to understand the patient experience through data collection, as well as regulatory education, and then sharing of that patient data to ensure that the patient voice is heard, reducing diagnostic delay through efforts like smart moves, and of course newborn screening, and then continuing our clinical care and the registry there. I believe, next slide, I believe that concludes the update for today, and I think we'll have a Q&A session later, so I'll transition it back over to Jess.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie, for sharing the incredibly informative presentation. A lot of information you covered, so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. So we did have a number of questions that came in for you, Jackie, and we'll ask you to join us back here shortly to answer as many of these questions as we can. There is still time to submit your questions if you have any in the questions box, which you can find located on your toolbar. And again, we'll try and get to those in the Q&A. But now we would like to introduce Rose Domingo-Horn. She's representing Biogen and will be sharing their presentation, The Transition from Pediatric to Adult Care in SMA. Rose?
Thank you so much for that introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Rose Domingo-Horn, and on behalf of Biogen, I will be sharing this educational presentation on transition of care in SMA. Next slide, please. Spinal muscular atrophy is a disease which affects individuals across the lifespan. With our advancing knowledge of SMA disease pathophysiology and the underlying genetic basis for disease, we can now think of the range of SMA phenotypes as representing a continuum of a single genetically defined disease, which can affect very weak infants to ambulatory children and adults. With the evolution of the standard of care in SMA and the development of 3 FDA-approved disease-modifying therapies, the trajectories for survival and motor function are changing, and therefore so is the phenotypic spectrum of disease. Next slide, please. In comparison to natural history, patients who receive one of the FDA-approved therapies may experience the achievement of more advanced motor milestones and fewer complications of their disease. For example, an infant with type 1 SMA may respond to treatment, thereby achieving improved survival and better motor function while still remaining classified under the current paradigm as a patient with type 1 SMA. But that child may even improve to the point that they experience a change in what would be the classic phenotypic classification of their SMA type to effectively appear indistinguishable from a patient with type 2 SMA. This impact on the evolution of SMA phenotypes with treatment and therapy may occur for any subtype or stage of the disease, including those patients who are identified and treated pre-symptomatically, essentially changing how we think about SMA and how it is classified. As the phenotypes of patients with SMA evolve and patients live longer and healthier lives, it is important to recognize and address the care needs that will emerge as they move beyond childhood into adolescence and adulthood. Next slide, please. The healthcare transition is the process of moving from a child model of healthcare to an adult model of healthcare with or without a transfer to a new clinician. This represents an evolution from a focus on pediatric care to a shared responsibility for healthcare by both pediatric and adult clinicians. This is especially important as young adults are increasingly being appreciated as a vulnerable population with high rates of behavioral health risks, low rates of healthcare utilization, and susceptibility to emerging or worsening of chronic health conditions. They also traditionally regard healthcare as a relatively low priority when it comes to their transition to adulthood. Traditionally, it has been reported that young adults do not receive adequate preparations when it comes to transitioning to care administration by adult clinicians or within adult healthcare systems. The adverse effects associated with the lack of a structured healthcare transition include medical complications, poor medication adherence, discontinuation of care, higher rates of dissatisfaction, higher rates of emergency department and hospital use, and higher costs of care. Next slide, please. The healthcare transition is part of a larger theoretical framework, which includes, but is not limited to, these principles: a youth or young adult-centered focus, self-determination and self-management, family and/or caregiver engagement and support, an acknowledgement of individual differences, complexities, and vulnerabilities, the need for early and ongoing preparations and integration into an adult model of care, effective communication, care coordination, and shared accountability, the recognition of cultural and socioeconomic influences on health, and the elimination of healthcare disparities. Next slide, please. While clinicians are becoming increasingly more aware of the importance of supporting a healthy transition of care for their young adult patients, they still report significant barriers, such as a lack of communication and coordination between pediatric and adult care providers, and their often very different practice styles. There may also be a lack of training around childhood onset illnesses among adult clinicians, and therefore a lack of adult specialists available to treat these patients. Parents and caregivers may also not appreciate their role in giving young people ways to increase their independence in seeking and managing their health care. A prominent barrier mentioned by youth with special health care needs and their caregivers is a difficulty in leaving the pediatric clinicians with whom they have had long-standing relationships. They may describe this transition as challenging or scary. They may also feel inadequately prepared for or educated about the transition process. Youths with medical complexities and special healthcare needs may have multiple healthcare providers, including nursing and ancillary staff, and may be very accustomed to the routines and services available in their children's hospitals and pediatric clinics. They may require frequent admissions or medical procedures, requiring more in-depth planning discussions with both their children's hospital teams and new adult hospital staff around their transition to adult care. Next slide, please. Documented benefits to a structured transition of care approach exist. Such benefits can be categorized in terms of quality of care outcomes, such as improved adherence to care, improved perceived health status, improved quality of life, and improved self-care skills, and service use outcomes, such as improved adult clinic attendance and a shorter period of time elapsing between a patient's last pediatric appointment and initial adult visit. Decreased hospitalization rates may also result. Due to these benefits and the recognition of the importance of this approach, pediatric and adult practices and systems and public health programs in the US are increasingly implementing structured processes for a transition to adult care. In pediatric and adult hospitals, complex care centers and transition clinics are being established to coordinate inpatient and outpatient care for youths and young adults, including those with complex medical conditions, recognizing the need for individualized planning and a collaboration between their pediatric and adult clinicians. Next slide, please. One of the ways in which the transition of care is being structured is through the development and utilization of specialized multidisciplinary clinics. Multidisciplinary care is the standard of care for adult and pediatric neuromuscular disorders and has been associated with improved quality of life, resource utilization, and health outcomes. It is delivered by way of the multidisciplinary clinic, in which care can be coordinated across multiple specialties at a single visit. This can help to streamline care and reduce travel burdens for patients, while also facilitating an integrative approach to care, including clinical research and patient advocacy. Multidisciplinary neuromuscular clinics are generally organized around specific neuromuscular patient populations and specialists. They are run by a neuromuscular specialist, generally a neuromuscular trained neurologist or physiatrist, and a team of other clinical specialists, such as pulmonologists, gastroenterologists, orthopedic specialists, social workers, physical, occupational, speech, and respiratory therapists, research and administrative staff, and patient advocacy group representatives. The teams involved in the care delivered at these multidisciplinary outpatient clinics can also help to establish communication and an exchange of clinical information with the clinicians who will care for patients during hospitalizations or inpatient procedures. In the context of a transition of care framework, multidisciplinary care clinics can be useful in establishing a transition of care team for each patient, thereby coordinating cohesive, continuous care across ages as a child approaches adolescence and transitions to adulthood. As mobile health technology advances, it may also be possible to extend multidisciplinary care beyond clinic walls, such as with a combination of telehealth visits, mobile health, and remote monitoring systems, which may improve the timeliness of medical evaluations and interventions, reduce costs, and improve the overall value of care. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for your time today. We hope that this was an educational presentation on the transition from pediatric to adult care in SMA. And we at Biogen look forward to speaking with the SMA community again soon.
Great. Wonderful, and thank you so much, Rose, for your presentation today. Really appreciate your time. So before we close out today's Summit of Strength webinar, we're going to address some of the questions that you all have sent in and for today's presentation. So Jackie, I see that you are back on, so welcome. We're going to go ahead and dive into the Q&A. So Jackie, our first question that came in is, do you know of any clinical trial for babies first treated with Spinraza and then switched over to Zolgensma?
There's not a clinical trial for babies who were treated with, I'm sorry, did you say Everest?
Spinraza first and then switched to Zolgensma.
No, there is one for infant or for persons who are treated with Zolgensma and then adding Spinraza on top of it, but not vice versa. We are trying to collect a lot of, we call that real world evidence or real world data from patients who are choosing to use multiple therapeutics to try to collect data on that and to see what kind of outcomes, but we currently don't have any data on that specific combination in that order or a clinical trial.
Perfect. Thank you, Jackie. And then you kind of stepped into the next question. So can you provide more details surrounding the combination of Evrysdi and Zolgensma?
Yeah, again, we don't have a trial looking at those two together, but we are trying to collect real world data from our care centers and through our care center registry that would involve patients who have chosen to use both treatments. And we're continuing to collect that over time and see what kinds of outcomes and things that those patients report.
Thanks, Jackie, for addressing both of those. Moving on to our next question. So can any SMA research or drug trials be expedited? With COVID-19 vaccines, it's proved that those trials can be expedited, and just wondering if any of that can be applied to cure SMA research and drug development.
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as expediting clinical trials, those all have to go through the FDA process. There are some designations that the FDA can offer and that have been given to clinical trials to try to make the process more efficient or more expedited. But in terms of that regulatory component, that is conversations that happen between the company developing the drug and the regulatory agency in the US, the FDA. As far as basic research and expediting that, Cure SMA tries to offer comprehensive funding to try to kind of come at it from multiple angles. We want to have a program that that looks at the different facets of disease in an attempt to understand different components to try to really identify potential novel drug targets. And so focusing on that kind of research program, I think, is, we believe, the best way to identify new drug targets the most quickly, while still ensuring that there's really good science being done to validate those.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jackie. Next question, do you have any data surrounding how children dosed pre-symptomatically with Zolgensma are doing? Are they developing any symptoms? Is it showing in the data?
Children dosed pre-symptomatically with Zolgensma, was that the question? Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing. Yeah, so if we go back to the slides, I'm not sure if we can do that or not. I can maybe pull them up here, trying to find them so I can tell you what slide number, but that trial, it's slide 9, if we can pull the deck back up. If not, that's fine too. So that pre-symptomatic Zolgensma trial is called SPRINT. And those infants are doing really well in terms of gaining motor function. So they If we look at infants with 2 copies of Smn2, which was one of the cohorts, and again, this was infants who were dosed at 6 weeks or less and had 2 or 3 copies of Smn2. Those with 2 copies of Smn2, all of them are currently alive and they don't need ventilatory support. 79% are sitting and 36% are standing alone, and 4 of the 14 or 29% achieved walking. And that's as of the June 2020 data cutoff. So we'll continue to get data from that sprint trial, but those infants seem to be doing quite well compared to natural history and continuing to gain motor function.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie, for answering that question. I think we're going to have time for just one last question here. Someone wrote in and said that they've heard that some patients who were on Spinraza and then switched to Evrysdi were feeling weaker. Is there any data on that?
We don't have any data on that. We've heard in anecdotal stories about that. So that is all the data we have. And again, we're trying to collect that information through our capturing real world data, but I don't have anything concrete to offer on those patients who switch from Spinraza to Evrysdi and that perception of feeling weaker at this time. So we hope to continue to collect that real world data in our registries and stuff and have more concrete information to report as we kind of have more and more people who are trying these drugs in different combinations and different orders and such.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for all of your insights and your information and for sharing your time with us today. And another big thank you to Shannon and Rose as well for your great presentations. I also want to say we appreciate everyone who joined in today. As usual, you'll be getting a follow-up email that'll have a survey link, and we really appreciate any feedback that you have to share. And we also want you to keep an eye out. You'll see on the PowerPoint, we've got 2 more upcoming Summit of Strength webinars, Care for the Caregiver on April 28th and Service Dogs on May 12th. Both are Wednesdays as usual for this program, so be sure to register and tune in. And once again, we're incredibly thankful for the support from our sponsors for making this Summit of Strength webinar series possible. If there's anything, again, that we can do for you, or if you have any additional questions, please give us an email at familysupport@curasma.org.